to the fall seminar. Those of you who haven't just joined us here at UK, these roughly happen twice a month. I wish I could say that they were absolutely consistent on the first and the third Friday, but we kind of work around labs so we can make sure we have our lab TAs in here, not only to present to us, but also to share with us. I really appreciate our speakers' willingness to lead off for the fall semester. In fact, we were just trying to figure out, or I was trying to go through my mind, how long it's been since we've had Dr. Wool here for to come and share with us. It's been too long, let's just say that. Dr. Wool, have you noticed he has like...
I'm at the bottom. Senior.
I know, but you didn't put all of them on. There's like, you know, how many, in fact, why aren't you a fellow of ACSM? You need to add something else in there, Tim.
I don't need any more letters.
Okay.
MOUSE, that's about it.
Tim is, I think, incredibly unique in his training. Unique in that he's a double-double. He is a physical therapist, but he is also a PhD in sports medicine. He is a University of Kentucky alumni. So he did his undergrad here. And let's see. And then after that, he, for 3 years, was in clinical practice at the Lexington Sport Medicine Center, where he worked to receive, he had moved to Michigan by then to get
after that.
His master's degree. And then his doctorate was at, go Who's? The University of Virginia. Wow, what else has there been in there? Staff and director of the Outpatient Physical Therapy Clinic at the Human Performance and Rehabilitation Center in Columbus, Georgia. He's been here, he just arrived a couple years ago.
Just a few.
Yeah, just a few years ago. He's a full professor in the College of Health Sciences. And if those of you have been fortunate enough to have him for a course, he has many expertise. One thing that I think he's absolutely known for is shoulders. You got a shoulder issue, he's your man. But he also helps out every now and then when you tear your Achilles.
Yes.
Welcome, Dr. Wool.
Thanks. Yeah, Jody and I, we became fast friends when I first got here, and she came, and then, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 years later, she calls me. It's Christmas break, so you know we're both assistant professors. We're hard at it, working on January 1st, 2nd, something like that. She goes, I think I sprained my ankle really bad. And she said, I was playing volleyball, I went home, visited family, and I just had trouble walking. She goes, felt like somebody hit me in the back of the ankle. I'm like, that is not an ankle sprain. So I walked over, and sure enough, me and another professor, and she had torn her Achilles. She had a positive Thompson's test. For those of you that know what that is, we squeezed the gastroc, and there was no foot motion at all. And so we had her in the doctor's office the next day, good old sports medicine, and in surgery within about 2 or 3 days, because you can't sit on those very long. But,
The next day.
Did you have surgery the very next day after that? It was
Yeah.
pretty quick.
Before he left,
Dr. Mayer is on top of it in sports medicine. Back when he wasn't quite as busy, maybe it's a little harder now. But I'm going to talk to you about a research study. So as Jody mentioned, I've been here for quite a while, 2 decades. Most of the research I do are with graduate students, so I can't get any of this stuff done. So Sean Love, who I heard just a few minutes ago now is the head athletic trainer at Louisville, maybe. So he's coming back to Kentucky. He was out in Kansas, and Angel Lazoo, who graduated last year, helped put a lot of this presentation together. And he works with the Chicago Cubs, so 2 of our illustrious alumni, and then a couple of us professors over at the College of Health Sciences. But what I'm going to talk a little bit about is mainly about the research study, but I'm also going to try to give you guys as young researchers, a little bit of information about how to put stuff together as you present. So we're all interested in exercise science, sports science, sports medicine, and so when you look at our population, this is sort of the breakdown of our population. There's about 50 million people, just a little under that, participating in some kind of level of youth sports. So everybody gets to participate when they're young. As we go into this, baseball specifically, there's almost 7 million people playing youth baseball. That percentage drops exponentially as you move up into the levels. And so I tried to do this so you could sort of see the drop. So in high school, looking at high school participation, I was impressed there was 1,000 women playing in high school baseball. When I grew up, that was probably very small, if any at all. But only 1 in 14 kids that play youth baseball go on and make it into high school. So only about 7%. And then even a smaller group, about 1 in 14 again, it's actually about the same percentage, make it into college. Any division level, Division II, Division III. So you're already talking about a pretty rare and unique population. And then out of those 35,000 athletes, in a year, there's about 1,200 that are drafted. That's 2%. So when they talk about all this stuff with professional baseball, we're talking about a very small group of human beings that are actually making it into professional baseball at that level. So a lot of the research you hear comes out of professional baseball, but it really has very little external validity because it doesn't apply to very many human beings. So a lot more research in youth baseball and high school baseball has a much wider appeal and much wider appreciation of actually our public health. RIO is a research entity that basically tracks high school injuries. And so RIO database was created by Don Comstock up at Ohio State a couple years ago, and she tracks high school athletic injuries using athletic trainers at 100 high schools throughout the U.S. And so when we talk about shoulder injuries from a time loss, the number of injuries, it's pretty small because they use the definition of time loss. That means you have to be out for at least 1 day to say you have a true injury. So it's only 1 to 2 injuries per 10,000 athletic exposures. That would be a practice or a workout or a game. And it's pretty consistent between baseball and softball. But 30% of all of those time loss injuries are not fractures, but muscle strain injuries. So even though it's a small percentage across all of these thousands of athletes, a lot of these are musculoskeletal, and most of them, based on the epidemiology, occur during practice. Recently, the athletic trainers, because we manage all kinds of injuries, not just injuries that hold people out, the focus has started to go on non-time loss. So a non-time loss injury, for those of you that are participating in the sports with an athletic trainer, is you can do X, Y, and Z, but you can't do everything. So you're in modified activities. And that really accounts for a lot more of the injuries. So this is a group of epidemiologists at a data list. Data list is sort of moved out of the NCAA and basically tracks high school and college injuries. But you can see in both high school and in college, about 30%, between 20 and 30%, almost up to 40% of all these injuries that are reported are actually non-time loss. So it's a pretty big problem that we have to deal with in athletic injuries and managing these sorenesses or achiness or problems in the shoulder and elbow. And by far, baseball and football, more contact-related injuries are the main components. The other thing you're probably seeing if you watch a little ESPN and you like baseball is this concept of a Tommy John. So a Tommy John, he was a famous pitcher a long time ago, and a guy named Frank Jobe out of California created an operation to reconstruct the medial ligament of the elbow. So it's called a UCL, ulnar collateral ligament. And so what we're seeing is this significant increase in UCL elbow injuries occurring in these high school and college athletes. So this was a study done in the Journal of Sports, Open Journal of Sports Medicine. they tracked 155 Division I baseball programs. That's about just a little over 5,000 athletes, and almost 2 to 3% of them in 1 year underwent UCL surgery. So that was 4 per 100 players having some kind of operation on their elbow. And the mechanism of UCL is volume of pitching and velocity of pitching. We see it more common in freshmen and sophomores because these kids are throwing to try to show off their skills in these high school showcases. Interesting enough, really no difference between warm and cold climates, so it really doesn't matter if you live in Kentucky or Florida, the rate of injury occurred at about the same component. We know that in youth baseball, definitely addressing the biggest population, that as pitch volume goes up, reported soreness and injuries go up. So about 50% of the pitchers in this study of a couple hundred pitchers down in Alabama reported shoulder or elbow pain at some point over a competitive season. Now, most of these kids didn't hold out, so they weren't time loss injuries, but they were having some aches and pains and taking some medicine or doing something to manage their soreness in their baseball. So it's very clear in the literature that as volume goes up, as pitching volume goes up, it's directly related to injuries. So you have a 6 or a 15% increase in the likelihood of elbow or shoulder injuries for every 10 pitches you throw. So the more you throw, the more likely you are to get hurt. That's where the pitch count rules came in for youth baseball from Lyman's research out of Dr. Andrews' clinic. About 75 pitches in a game seemed to be the cut point where it was a little bit, staying below that was a little safer, at least for the elbow, but still a great risk for shoulder problems. So we sort of have this concept, there's a volume injury relationship as we're moving through, and a volume soreness relationship as we go through all of these components. All of this is overuse. We have to understand what is the training volume that these kids are going under. What do they do during a game? They count pitches. What do they do during practice? Nothing. So we don't really know what is the volume of pitches that a player is doing during a game, during a practice. But our folks over in Australia and New Zealand and a couple other places have looked at cricket. Cricket is an overhead throwing sport, and they started to track workload as an injury risk. So it's not baseball, but it's very close and it's very similar. So what they found is that an acute overload, 1 episode or 1 week of activity, relative to that background over the last 3 or 4 weeks, had a significant effect, negative effect, on your training load and your risk of injury. So an overload has a negative effect on both pitching performance and injury risk. So you can have an overload and then not have a problem that next week, but even up to 3 or 4 weeks down the road, there could be a problem. So we need to monitor the pitch volume or the swing volume or the throwing volume that our athletes are going through constantly throughout the year. So Tim Gavitt has done some really nice research, and he sort of has this window of load volume. So you can look at pitch volume or throwing volume or swing volume week to week. He looks at it as an acute to chronic workload. So this is an increase you might see in a typical athletic competition like volleyball or baseball. You might have 200 swings in a week. The athlete is training, they gradually increase that load. They have maybe a 25-20%. You're in that threshold of what Tim Gavitt suggests is right on that cusp of having injury. But if you look at the load over an average of these 3 weeks, 200, 250, 300, that averages out to 250. But if they have a big episode and they go up to 400 pitches, that's a 60% increase in workload. So their change in workload is significantly increasing their likelihood of injury risk. But we don't monitor that on a regular basis. It's sort of like we don't track that volume of activity during that component. So this, anything over a 30% increase in that acute to chronic workload is sort of considered a dangerous zone. Doesn't mean you're gonna get hurt, but your likelihood increases that you can get hurt. So, what do we know? There's a lot of people participating. Not all of them are losing time, but they're dealing with problems that we as athletic trainers have to manage. Sore back, sore shoulder, sore elbow. High volume of throwing, pitch counts are really only done during a game situation, which I'll show doesn't really account for much of what they're actually doing. There's a lot of attention on workload, and so we need to take what our brethren researchers have done in Australia, like Dr. Best, and other folks, to sort of take that information and start applying it to sports that are a little bit more common here in the United States. Not too much cricket in the United States. But this relative change in throwing volume seems to be a very good indicator as to what's going on with our athletes. There might be a prodromal response that we can start to say, you might be at risk. Therefore, we were interested in what is the level of soreness and throwing volume in our college pitchers here at UK. So I'm going to put my professor hat. I tried really hard to put your face right here, Jody, but it didn't quite work.
They can imagine it.
So now I'm going over here to talk to you guys as a professor. When you all come up with a research idea, don't just study what's cool. Build a rationale. Build a case. Understand the population. Understand the problems in your population. Then come up with your research design. Ooh, we got this cool new thing in the lab. I want to do some study. I'm sort of interested in that. Don't let the equipment drive your question. Let the problem drive your questions. Then figure out what the right equipment is. All right, back to the presentation. That was a little research design 101. So we had two primary purposes. One is to study and the relationship between pitch volume and self-reported arm soreness. And then the secondary purpose is see, is there a relationship between the change, what happens over time, between pitch volume and arm soreness over the course of a college baseball season? Because we had never tried to apply this concept in baseball. So we set out to do a prospective cohort study where we tracked over an entire season, fall and spring, for our pitchers at the University of Kentucky. So we looked at athletic exposure, so you got to know what kind of activities they're doing. We used self-reported soreness. We collected this data a while ago. We just got it published. Welcome to research and being busy. There are now instruments. There's a device called the M-Modus, and it basically can track pitch volume. You have to put a sleeve. Baseball players don't like putting sleeves on their throwing arm, but it's an inertial measurement unit that could be used that might help improve monitoring pitch volume. But the key difference is we tracked what happened during games and during practices for everything. And then we use basically self-report questionnaires for the soreness. So we got 7 of our about 12 to 15 pitchers to agree to do the study. We had 6 participants sign up week 1, right as the season started, and we had another 7th one who finally agreed after week 2. So our fall season is short. It's only 13 weeks. It's basically September, October, and a little bit of November up to Thanksgiving. And then the spring season is the main competitive season in college baseball, and that starts usually when everybody comes back from winter break. So it's important to calculate exposures because we need to know what the athletes are doing. Are they working out? Are they full go? Are they modified activities? So we broke it into these categories. You were injured, you couldn't participate, or you could be sick. You were injured, but you were modified, you could only do conditioning, or you had limited practice activities. You might be just having a workout day. That could be for the entire team. And then actual practice and games, full go. Soreness we use the same concept of a numeric pain rating scale, 0 to 10, but if you tell athletes, are you in pain, they'll always say no. So we changed the wording a little bit and asked them to rate their level of soreness. Soreness and pain need to have context. You can't just say, what's your pain level? Because it matters if you're sitting or standing or walking or throwing a baseball. So you have to ask them in relationship to context of different activities that they might do throughout the day. And then we counted pitch volume. Now, in this study, we depended on the athletes to self-report. We tracked a few athletes, so we have an error, probably about 15% either side of the number that they report. So our athletic trainer would watch and actually try to follow a couple athletes. But we felt like to manage and deal with 7 different pitchers doing different things during a practice, that this was a reasonable assessment of what they were doing. So each type of day, they might do different activities, but this pretty much covers a typical workout that an athlete might do. So they could just warm up and throw catch. They could do a long toss program. They could be throwing, pitching from the flat level surface, not up on a mound. Bullpen is always done from a mound, so they can do that on practice day bullpens, not when they're actually competing. And then we have game day bullpens and then actual game pitches. Now game pitches we got directly from the pitch counts that the coaches actually calculate, but we captured all the other stuff as self-reported information. So this is sort of the form we would hand to the athlete after they walked off the field and take them like 5 seconds, 10 seconds. So they would write numbers down. They did no throwing that day. They did 20 catches. They might have done 10 long toss, and they might have thrown 25, 30 pitches in a bullpen for practice. And then we would ask them their level of soreness. Soreness at rest, soreness during baseball, and soreness during other activities. So it's just a basic, took them all of 5 or 10 seconds to fill out. And then the graduate student got to sit in front of Excel and enter all the data over the course of time. Most of the workload data that's out there in the literature uses a 1-to-4 ratio. I played with 1-to-4 and 1-to-3, and I felt like 1-to-3 was a little bit representative. In other countries, they play sports pretty much continuously, almost like professional athletes. Here, we have these school breaks. So we have these nice breaks in the summer and in the winter that sort of break things up. So I modified our counts to 1-to-3. So I look at 3 weeks prior, that gives me an average value, and I compare it to the current week. That's my acute. So if you throw 300 pitches every week, and then the next week you throw 400, that's about a 100-point increase. That's a third increase, right? So that would be a 1.3. So when the value is greater than 1, that means they increase by a percentage, 20, 30, 40%. And if it's less than 1, that means that week, if they were throwing 300 pitches a week and they go down to 200, now they're going to drop down and it'll be a fraction of that. So it'll be down around 6, 0.6 I should say, 0.7. So this is sort of data that we were collecting. This is from one player. So this is a typical week during a practice. I can't remember if this fall or spring. So this is how many pitches in a week a typical pitcher throws, if you count everything. So 1,200, 1,600. You go into Major League Baseball or you look at some of the other data, that might be the total amount that they say they throw over the course of a few games. So it's actually way underestimating what's going on. This is their level of soreness. We'd ask those 3 questions. We sum that up and we get that information. So in this case, you can see a little precursor here. The percentage increase, it went up 8%, and this went up 10%. So sort of suggests that they follow each other a little bit, and that's exactly what we found to a large degree. So our statistical analysis, we're looking at relationships, not for differences, so we're going to do correlations. We broke the data out and looked at it by fall, spring, and then the total season to see if we saw variabilities among those seasons if things were analyzed. We did correlations, Pearson product correlations. There's only 7 people The Spearman correlation, because of the small sample size, would be appropriate here too. We basically got exactly the same number, and our data was normally distributed. So we felt good about reporting the Pearson correlations. So this is a busy slide, sorry. So this is broken up into fall, spring, and total season. This is their athletic exposures. So you can see this is the total count, 39 days missed. 73 and 79 were some kind of modified limited activity for our 7 pitchers. They got about a quarter of the days off during the fall. They were totally at rest. We actually followed the NCAA guidelines. Conditioning only, small percentage, and then practice was about 30% of the season in the fall and about 37 game days. They played inter-squad scrimmages, white versus blue, however they want to do it. So you can see games only represent about 5% of the fall, a little bit more in the spring, but only 12% of the games. 53% of the time they're practicing. Only 12% are games. Obviously games are important, the intensity goes up, but the volume is the volume is the volume. Not as many days missed or totally out, a lot less modification. We tend to protect people more in the fall, or they're doing rehabs to gradually get them back in after they've had surgery in the summer or in the previous season. But total, across the entire year, we had 153 exposures of games, but many more exposures to practice, and why I felt like it was really important for us to start looking at activities during practice, not just during game components. This is our pitch volumes. So this is the total number of pitches thrown by our 7 athletes. So you can see most of the energy is in the warm-up when there's nothing really being done other than talking about what they're going to do in the weekend or what they did last night, and they're sort of just warming up low-intensity activities. So the volume is high, the intensity is low, but they're spending a lot of time fiddle farting around with this catch long toss. The long toss is more of an endurance training, trying to build strength and endurance in the arm, and then bullpens are actually when they're actually working on their balls, delivery, their slider, their curveball, those activities. Obviously game bullpens are warm-up, but actual game volume of throw, this only represents 12% during the competitive season of all the throws they make for an entire season. So overall about 10% if you include the fall ball, which aren't real counted games. So you can see we're counting their pitch count around something that they do very little of. So it's not really giving us a very good total exposure. So these are our correlations. So blue is fall. These are the individual 7 subjects. Orange is spring. So when we looked at the fall data, we were like, ooh, this doesn't look so great. Correlation isn't so wonderful. Really no correlation at all, with an R value of negative 0.6. But when you look at the spring, during the competitive season, as volume goes up, as your pitch counts increase, your soreness significantly increases. So a much more positive linear correlation, 0.86, which is explaining how much of the variance? I heard this. How much of the variance is explained? What's 8 times 8? What's 8? Come on, y'all grad school, right? Huh? 64. Explain 64% of the variance. R squared. If you look at it across the total season, still pretty significant. Definitely driven by what's going on in the spring. If you notice, in the fall, it's shorter, right? A lot less volume of throws. But even if you just include the spring competitive season, as pitch volume goes up, and obviously this guy and 2 of these guys were starters, the other 5 were all relievers, but we definitely had a reliever that was throwing high volume. Starters always throw more than relievers throughout the season. But you can see some of these guys nowhere close to what they did in the fall. They were all over what they were doing in the fall, one probably because of the longer season, but also more emphasis because it's a competitive component. So we have a pretty good correlation between pitch volume and the total soreness counts. Now when we get into that acute to chronic workload, so I took 3 weeks of data for pitch volume, that was my average, and I divided that by the acute workload to sort of see what is the rate of change, percent change, and I did the same thing for soreness. So this is the workload change. So 1 means they did the same on a current week as they did in the previous 3 weeks. A little less, a little more. And again, you see a pretty significant correlation of a 0.6 as their workload increases, their arm soreness increases, not just from day to day, but actually average across all of these weeks. And this is for the total season of activity. So I think it's really, there's a few important points. Pitch counts during a game doesn't really capture what we're dealing with. We have to capture more data than that. So 88% of all the throws that are made during the season actually occur outside of a game. This is the first study looking at baseball pitchers. I'm sure there'll be more, but there's a pretty good, strong correlation between arm soreness and pitch volume, and maybe not monitoring what's going on as they change activities and talking to the performance coaches. We need to be a little bit more cued in to how fast do we step things up. The literature shows that across the season in youth baseball. This is the first study looking at collegiate athletes. So if you look at this, this is representative of one player, their pitch count ratios and their soreness ratios, just plotted a little differently, but you can see it doesn't follow exactly, right? It wasn't a perfect correlation, but the spikes in soreness seem to go along with the spikes in throwing volume. So changing and tracking that over the course of a season definitely would be logical to go on and do that. Whether you're tracking soreness or you're tracking pitch counts, you're pretty much tracking similar ideas depending on what your available level is. So we only had 7, so it's probably not realistic to try to predict injuries. So we focus mainly just on that arm soreness and sort of this concept of non-time loss. Self-reported pitch volume and arm soreness allowed us to track these workload volumes, but we did see something really interesting that I think has a strong clinical application. So there's this concept called negative training stress. So if you drop down and taper your activities, you're now lowering that average or that chronic workload, and so you're now at a greater risk for injury. So Hulen has shown this in the cricket athletes. And so when there's less external workload or chronic workload over the previous weeks, 63% of the injuries that occurred in their study occurred in this negative training balance. So we actually had an athlete develop medial elbow pain. Imagine that, UCL type injury. So this is the weeks, spring and fall. This is their pitch counts, and arm soreness is in orange. And then in gray is the workload. So this is their weekly pitch volume. So you can see at the beginning of the fall, he was making that nice high elevation as they go up into that volume. Soreness is on a different scale. I couldn't put everything on there. But he had a little bit of increase in soreness as he went through there, but not really super intense. And then sometime right in here, we had some issues. So this is his workload. It pretty much tracks that pitch volume almost identically. And I just want to remind you, 1 to 2 is safe, right? 1.0, 1.1, 1.2. But if you notice on his workload, he has 2 days in the fall that exceed that and get into this 25, 30%, 40% increase in workload. What happened with this athlete is he got bronchitis. So he was sick, and he had to shut down his throwing volume because he was sick. He had limited activities. He wasn't totally out of pitching, but he was really significantly modified for a couple of weeks. Oh, I gotta get going, I wanna get back in, I'm a player, I wanna make the team do well. Guess what? After 2 consecutive weeks of doing exactly the same pitch volumes, around 70, 75 pitches, 2 weeks later, his elbow started hurting. So he went up significantly from where he had the bronchitis, also known as bronchitis, something I cut out there. Down here, he increased. That's his spike in workload. And within 2 weeks, he had to be shut down completely, and that's where you see in this activity that his elbow hurt too much, he couldn't keep pitching. We had another pitcher at the end of the spring season. He had no throwing for weeks 13 and 14 because he had mono. Makes sense. Week 15, he's starting to feel better. So his average for those 3 weeks was 38 pitches. He's a starter. He wants to get back. What does he do in week 16? 400 throws. Hey, I'm feeling great. Let me get going. So that is a 10-fold increase in workload volume. Guess what happened to him in the next 2 weeks? Week 18, we had to shut him down because of the shoulder pain. So it's not the end-all be-all answer to everything, but it certainly is giving us an idea of what we might want to spend our energy tracking and dealing with to help us prevent some of these injuries as our goal. Study has lots of limitations. 7 subjects, small sample size, 1 team, 1 coaching philosophy, and pitch volumes are self-reported. So what have we learned from this? Many pitches that fatigue the arm are not counted. There's a lot of stuff going on that we have no idea what we're appreciating these arms are being put through. The studies that show increase in workloads or increase with soreness, it might be predictive of actually injuries. I feel like that's probably the most important thing, those 2 little cases that we found. And maybe monitoring workload gradually to progress throwing volume back from week to week needs to be higher on the coaches and the athletic trainers' priority. Now this is for Jody and Rosie, right? Volleyball. So we were doing a similar study with the volleyball team, so I'm going to just show you a quick graph. This is the total swings of the UK volleyball. We got all 19 of the athletes to participate. This is their reported injuries by frequency. Red is out, limited, full go, with a little soreness. And then the blue line is their total swings with the little volleyball. First week, 2 days, we had a few injuries. A couple of people were sore. It's the mental toughness. Second week of 2 days, the volume goes up to 6,000 swings for the entire team. A lot of soreness, a lot of people out or in modified activity. Finish up with preseason, right? Things are starting to go down in workload volume, but we still have quite a few athletes that are out or modified. And then we have the rest of the season. So during the competitive season, the entire team never swings more than 3,000. But during those 2 days, by golly, we need to crush them. And look what happens to the injury rate. It's almost gone. So the coaches try to drive home that they have to do all of this stuff so quick, so fast, and we have this lasting effect into the first couple weeks of season that are actually causing some injuries. So we did some mathematical calculations and broke it up into preseason and regular season and found that there was a high relationship between training volume or swing volume, I should say, and injuries in a sport. So again, overuse injuries, we need to count the volume of what's going on. This sweet graduate student counted swings of every practice on videotape for 2 years. God bless her soul. But she got a publication out of it, so that's good. So obviously our goal is to try to do this with the entire pitching squad, hopefully reach out to other SEC teams or other teams in the area to identify these risk factors. We know there's some other risk factors at the beginning of the season, that are contributory that weren't accounted for in here, like range of motion and strength. But I think this would help improve this external validity. Thanks for your attention. It's my wife's birthday, so this is a very happy wife when we were out in Maui a couple of years ago. Thanks. I'll be happy to answer questions if there are any. Yes, Mark?
Tim, can you speak to the pitch type? They talk about like youth throwing curveballs, and is that an issue? Does that put more stress on the UCL? Do you know?
No.
Doesn't.
Doesn't. Volume and velocity. So there is this concept, you can't throw a curveball till you shave. They've done some biomechanical studies, they just haven't found it. It's velocity. When you look at the major league, the guys who throw the hardest blow out their UCL. It's not the curveball.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now there's a lot of kids that throw a curveball bad that doesn't help, but it's not the curveball. It's the velocity.
Sure.
When the kids are all shooting for 90, 95 and doing anything and everything to get to 90 and 95, that's what blows their arm out in the ball.
Yeah.
So that they throw a curveball probably isn't necessarily the best thing unless they're well coached. And there's a lot of parents that are coaches that don't have the experience or knowledge base of somebody with an exercise science degree that understands baseball mechanics. But the science doesn't support that it's just the curveball. It's the velocity and the ball. Good question. Yes, ma'am.
I know that you all weren't looking at risk of injury within your baseball study, but
The what?
you weren't looking at risk of injury within your baseball study.
No,
but
right.
when developing the study, did you find any research that found a correlation between perceived soreness and risk of injury?
In other sports, yes. So there is some literature like soreness has been related to muscle fatigue and also to creatine kinase changes in those levels. So it is somewhat of a precursor that's been shown in the literature, and that was something that's what we treat as athletic trainers. So somebody comes in and says, my hammies tight, my shoulder's sore, what can you do for me? And really probably what's going on ultimately is the coaches are asking them to do too much, too fast, and they haven't recovered from the last training stimulus, and that's what I'm sort of on the pulpit preaching about is let's plan this out a little bit better. And then obviously mechanics was another component. We do know in baseball, especially in college and youth and professional, mobility of your shoulder, strength of your shoulder are increased injury risk factors that's been well established in the literature. Yes, Joe?
Pardon my naivety about baseball pitchers.
You can ask about volleyball, that's fine.
Okay. Do they take anything routinely, an anti-inflammatory or,
Eat them like candy. Naproxen and ibuprofen. I don't know if there's any baseball or softball players in here, but at most Division I schools that I've been at, and you said Michigan and Virginia, most of those kids are on chronic anti-inflammatory medicine, whether it's prescribed or self-induced. They can get a lot of that stuff over the counter. So they do take a lot of those kind of medicines. I don't know if they're doing much on the omega-3 fatty acids and the fish oils and those components, which might be a little easier on the liver. But at the same time, I do know that those are handed out pretty regularly, pretty frequently, and are common, along with, unfortunately, some other substances that might help reduce pain that are illegal and legal at times, right? This whole opioid issue in our country. But there's a lot of beer being drunk, a lot of marijuana, I'm sure, being used to help reduce some of the discomfort that these athletes have. Just being realistic, I'm sure there's other medicines that are being consumed.
I just wonder about the effect, not only in reducing soreness or pain, but to the actual ligaments themselves. I mean, does it, medications like that stiffen?
No, it weakens
Bad
it.
word,
Yeah,
but-
the anti-inflammatories tend to weaken it. There's some nice studies out of Japan where they've taken and had, they've put them in a valgus stress load, they take an ultrasound and measure the ligament stiffness, and then they go out and throw, and they're seeing that those ligaments definitely stretch out over the course as your body warms up and those components. There's other studies that have been done that show that healing of those stretched ligaments is reduced when you're on anti-inflammatories.
Reduced.
It actually slows it down initially in those first 2 weeks, so it's not ideal. It's your body telling you, okay, I need to recover, and we're masking that so I can go and throw the next day. And I think that's the disconnect that is really occurring because everybody thinks more is better, and more is not necessarily better. It is, gradual increase to get to more and then sustaining at that level. And I think where we see a lot of our injuries, just like I showed in volleyball, I don't know what those kids are doing in July. Their volume could be like that, but my guess is it's not. And now they've peaked up. August 9th comes, baby. Coaches have been waiting all summer, all kinds of drills. Let's go, baby. 2 or 3 a days, and then the volume is just so high, and their body doesn't have enough time. So we know in high school football, right, Kentucky has really done a good job of accommodation. So they start high school football July 10th in Kentucky. And it's no pads for a week, doing out there, getting in the heat, and then they go into activities around July 15th or 16th. They start putting helmets and shoulder pads and stuff on. So they have a much longer gradual. So I think this idea of having a bigger preseason, of gradually increasing those loads, and there's really no need to get the 6,000 volleyball swings for 15 athletes when you're only going to do 2,000 or 3,000 in reality. You don't need to overtrain that much. That's sort of that high volume swimming load, right? I haven't studied swimmers, but they seem to have this high volume, and I don't know how fast they get them up there. I haven't studied any of that, but my guess is it's relatively quick.
It was a real problem, and one of Carl Matacola's students came over here and we did some scanning because when the swimmers come back, typically the pool is drained.
Yeah.
And so they're painting and repairing, and so they send them out to, run 5 miles. And they were having, shin splints and all
Stress
this.
fractures.
Yeah. Dr.
Take-
Toki finally said, well, somebody do a study so we can, have proof that says, look, dry land training's great for the swimmers, but maybe you ought to ease them into that a little more rather
Maybe
than
we
just.
shouldn't take people who like to do this and not do this very much. Go a little easy. Yes, sir. How you doing, man? I haven't seen you in a few weeks, months.
You already spoke to saying that most of the pitchers that have Tommy John are the ones that throw the hardest.
Yes, sir.
So within all these pitch counts, like say the smallest percentage of pitch counts came, say, from the game. But within those pitch counts, they're probably every pitch is at 95 or above effort, 95% or above effort. Whereas the majority of the other pitches, would you say, like it seemed like it wasn't tracked? I guess I'm talking about quality of pitches over quantity and volume. Whereas if I'm throwing, a lot of 95% and above, say I'm throwing, 400 pitches like that during the week, I go to a game, they cut me off at 75. Would you think that would have something to do with it? Like say if you're prepared to throw 400, 100 mile an hour fastballs, then you go to a
You
game,
would not be
you
in
throw
college
75.
anymore. You would be making millions of dollars if you could do that. But yes, no, I think, and that was sort of my point, is half the pitchers are sort of just me and you going out tossing, not really focusing on what they're probably going to need to do in the game situation. So I think what you're saying is one more step deeper is to actually how many fastballs, how many sliders, how many curveballs, what was the speed. And they captured that during the game, but also during practice. What intensity, are they working at 70, 80, 90%? Or are they working at 40, 50, 60? My guess is they're probably in the 60 to 80% most of the time, especially when they're doing bullpen flat grounds. I don't know about the catch and throws. My guess those are probably 20%. But I do think, and this is where a good warm-up, they're doing that to warm their arm up to get it loose. So the mindset is, I need to get my shoulder loose, and the way they do that is throwing. So that's putting some level of load on the ligaments and the tendons and that tissue. Instead of, let me get a stretch, let me do a few exercises in the training room, a little massage maybe, and now maybe I only need 20% percent of those volume of pitches to feel loose. So there's been some studies out in Phoenix, Arizona, nice hot area, easy to warm up, where when they do a massage stretching routine, they reduce the volume of pitches that an athlete says, I'm ready, significantly. We've also seen some gentle eccentric exercises has decreased that between inning volume of pitches, that they feel looser even before they go out on the field. But I think it is a cumulative effect just for those overload components. But I think getting to your point, as we make this aware to them, then we need to look at what is the quality of pitch would even help us more identify that.
Yeah, it seems like it benefits, looking at soreness, you could also add one step, what was your perceived effort that you put in for today?
Yeah, that's exactly how we were getting ready to do this study, and our baseball trainer took a job at the University of South Carolina, so we're hiring a new baseball trainer at UK. So we were doing perceived exertion on top of these other measures to get the external workload to see how hard he was working. But I think you're 100% right. Cool. Well, thanks for your attention. I know there's a class in here, but I don't want to hold it up. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Has there been a study comparing arm velocity between a fastball and a curveball? Because typically, as a pitcher, you're taught for your arm to look the same
Right.
during fastball and curveball. So I was wondering if there's ever been a study of that. So
Yeah. I'm pretty sure there is. Glenn Fleissig out of Alabama Sports Medicine, used to be Andrews. He's done most of that research, him and Gretchen Oliver, and I think they've looked at some of those velocities. There's not a significant drop in Major League Baseball players. Now, what a high school player does, I can't answer that as much, but theoretically at the top level, there's not a tremendous drop. But there has been some research looking at arm velocity and torques on your elbow with different components. Supposedly, when you talk to the best pitchers, it's what you do with your hand and wrist, not so much what you do with your arm and your arm side. Last question.
So do you think there should be pitch limits like over the preseason and like over the entire season so that you can kind of drop injuries?
I think there needs to be this build up. So if I'm pitching and he's pitching, we're three different body types. We're all good enough to pitch. Maybe I'm it at 40. I'm done. I'm pooped. He might be at 60. He might be at 100. So I don't think we can say there's a limit for pitch volumes. I think it's good for kids. It's something easy and it's somewhat enforceable. It's not always followed. But I think it needs to be individualized, that you have a pitcher that's a starter or a reliever, and he or she needs to have a volume that sort of is their ideal zone of where they can participate at. I think high chronic workload is okay if you can tolerate it. Like, if you ask Nolan Ryan, he's a unique human being and famous, but he was God-given. High chronic workload was his way to be a Hall of Famer. Most people aren't him. Most people aren't LeBron. Most people aren't Michael Jordan. Cool.